The comms were fractured. Half the team was out of position. The other half, waiting for orders that hadn't come. Dust choked the approach corridor. Satellite link was degraded. Every screen showed static. In the back corner of the ops tent, Sergeant Lena Mora traced a grid line no one had redrawn. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't flag anyone down. She picked up her pack, keyed a single coordinate, and stepped out without permission. By the time command realized the pattern had shifted, her mark was already on target. No one had asked her, but she had seen it. The morning heat came early, rising off the gravel in soft waves that blurred the edges of tents and vehicles parked along the fire line. Radios crackled low across the camp as responders clustered in loose formation near the whiteboard. It leaned unevenly against the command trailer, streaked with dry erase smudges and sun-faded notes from the day before. Riley Tran stood behind the last row, not quite in the shade. Her Fireline notepad balanced in one hand. The corners of the cover were curled from use, softened by heat, and darkened by ash. She kept it open anyway. One finger tucked along the page margin, where she had recorded a wind shift anomaly before dawn. The incident commander, a local with sun-leathered skin and a ball cap that had lost all color, gestured toward the board with a capped marker. His voice was even and quick, running through assignments like a checklist. Teams were split between active control and structured defense. Hotshot crews were already staged on the ridge. Water drops were grounded due to visibility, and containment remained stable, pending reassessment once the federal unit arrived. No one called Riley's name. She waited another few beats, then shifted her weight, her boots pressing into the fine dust until a small line formed near her toes. A faint breeze carried the scent of scorched pine and chemical retardant. Somewhere behind her, a chainsaw revved once, then fell silent. When she stepped forward and cleared her throat to offer a comment on the line jump near Sector Delta, something that didn't match the mapped heat signature, no one turned. One of the contractors near the front glanced at her, offered a tight nod without listening, and turned back before she finished her sentence. The incident commander was already moving on. A convoy rolled in half an hour later, black Suburbans, unmarked. Their tires kicked up dust that hung low over the command post. Out of the vehicles came figures in green-gray uniforms, all clean and unhurried. None of them visibly armed, but none appearing surprised by the terrain. They moved with that quiet tempo. Riley remembered, disciplined, detached, and uninterested in being introduced. One of them unfolded a comms array on the back of a flatbed, while another unrolled a thin sheet of synthetic film across a folding table. It wasn't standard perimeter gear. No one explained what it was. By midday, the whiteboard had been erased. In its place, a laminated sector map was pinned against the side of a trailer, ringed with highlighter, but missing labels on 2 quadrants. Riley scanned it twice. The area east of the reservoir where the wind shift had flared was marked as contained no timestamp, no team code. She looked for her name again. It didn't appear. One of the federal liaisons approached her as she refilled her canteen at the supply drum. He was courteous, smiled without warmth, said her experience was noted, especially with prior service, and they could use her on Ridge 6. Low activity zone. Perimeter watch only. A fire line already drawn and cooled. Just presence. His voice held no judgment. But she heard the category, not needed, not integrated, just placed. She nodded once, tucked her notepad back into the front pouch of her vest, and walked to the gear tent. Inside, the map posted beside the radio log still showed the southern flank as under review. A red circle had been sketched over the same section that had been marked green outside. She stared at it for a moment, wondering if anyone else had seen the difference. When she reached Ridge 6 just before nightfall, the sun had dropped behind the smoke band and turned the treetops orange-gray A metal chair had been left in the dirt near a downed log. No patrol passed? No radio check came through. The air was still except for a low hum just enough to raise the hair on her arms. It came from the valley floor. Pulsing under the quiet, she took out her notepad again. The edges were soft now. Pages marked in tight handwriting from days no one had asked about. She wrote nothing new. Just ran a thumb along the paper and waited. The fire line had gone quiet by mid-morning. But the land still held heat like breath trapped beneath skin. Riley moved alone through a corridor of blackened trees, boots crunching softly against charred bark and brittle ash. The ground gave slightly under her step, spongy from what had once been root and mulch. Smoke drifted in low ribbons between the trunks, curling without urgency. Nothing moved except the distant shimmer of heat rising from the valley below. Her radio stayed clipped to her shoulder. Silent. She had been told to maintain presence. That was the phrasing they used. Not patrol. Not assess. Just presence. No backburns scheduled. No spot fire suppression. Just walk the line and keep an eye out. It was the kind of instruction that sounded like trust, but wasn't. Her breath had fallen into rhythm by the second kilometer. Inhale for 5 steps. Exhale for 5 more. Each interval measured against the slope, calibrated by terrain. A habit she hadn't broken since the army. She didn't need a pace counter. Her body remembered. The terrain curved inward, forming a shallow bowl where the flames should have deepened, but they hadn't. A small grove stood untouched at the center of the black ring green. Upright, its bark wet with dew. No natural fire would have skipped that interior. Riley paused at the edge, crouched, and traced her finger along the soil. The burn line stopped abruptly at a clean arc, like someone had drawn a boundary with a compass. Wind didn't make lines like that. It smeared. It curled. She made a note of the GPS marker in her head, but didn't speak into the mic. Half an hour deeper. The incline sharpened. The ground turned gritty with rock fragments and baked clay, still warm underfoot. Her boot clipped a shallow ridge, and something metallic clinked free from the ash. She crouched again, brushing carefully until the shape resolved. It was a shard, half melted, darkened by heat, not scorched like aluminum, too thick for firefighting equipment, too smooth for fencing or tool metal. She turned it once in her glove, watching the soot smear against the ridges. Near one corner, blackened but legible, were stamped digits. A tag code, not civilian. She pocketed the shard without comment. Above her, the treetops leaned sideways in the wrong direction. Burn patterns should have followed the slope, racing uphill with the draft. But the damage here pointed east against the natural pull. Another loop, another oddity. She knelt beside a blackened stump and opened her small field sketch pad. One page folded tight against the next. The lines were already drawn topography. Fall lines. Last known containment map. She didn't update the drawing. She just shaded the area she had just walked through. Lightly. One arc of pencil marking the grove. Another pass darkened the slope, where the wind logic had failed. On the back of the page, in a corner already worn thin from use, she wrote one note in small print. Circle inside fireband. No heat score. Unnatural stop. She folded the notebook again and moved on. There was no sound in the forest, except the whisper of cooling embers. And even that faded. The deeper she walked, a bird should have called by now. A small animal should have moved, but nothing did. Even the insects seemed to avoid the burn's edge. That kind of silence wasn't just post-fire. It was deliberate. She'd seen it before, in places no longer on maps, where what burned had never been meant to regrow. She didn't call it in. At the next rise, she stopped to drink from her canteen and scan the horizon. The smoke off the eastern ridge was thinner now, too thin to match the recorded burn rate. She raised her eyes to the ridgeline and held the image in memory. One sweep, then another. Then she dropped her gaze and kept walking. The antenna shard pressed lightly against her side through the vest. Nature had rules. Gravity, wind, fuel. Fire followed them until something made it break. And when it broke too cleanly, it meant someone else had rewritten the logic. The folding chairs in the operations tent creaked in quiet intervals, one after another. As responders dropped into place around the central table, a projected map buzzed faintly on the far wall, its outline smeared slightly by the canvas seams behind it. Fire sectors glowed in shifting shades of orange and blue. Sector Echo had just been reclassified as cooling. Ridge 6, where Riley had spent the afternoon alone, wasn't mentioned. The air inside the tent smelled of synthetic coffee, polypropylene, and the sweat of long hours. Fans pushed air lazily through a filter unit mounted high in the corner. Giving just enough hum to feel like motion, Riley sat at the back edge. Her annotated behavior chart folded neatly across her lap. She had updated it before walking in. Just 3 notations: wind back interference, pattern anomaly, and a heat signature that reversed direction without slope justification. She didn't rush to speak. She waded through the brief, through the containment review, through the risk tier updates. When the room paused, she raised her hand halfway, then stood and spoke in full sentences. She described the burn ring that hadn't entered the grove. She mentioned the wind pattern shift that didn't match the forecast drift. She offered her coordinates and directional readings. One of the federal analysts turned toward her with a practiced smile. His tablet stayed on his lap. He thanked her for field eyes and said that terrain folds sometimes created countercurrents, especially in microbursts. Another analyst, younger, scrolled through a file and said the satellite overlay didn't indicate fuel deviation. He called it ember behavior. Normal skip. Nothing unusual. Riley held her chart out. The fire line on it curved back on itself. A clean loop, with no viable jump source. She had marked it with thin black arrows. Noted time, temperature, wind, and direction. No one took it from her. The containment lead, calm and polished, chimed in from the far end. He leaned slightly against the table, speaking as if guiding a classroom. He said the incident had already been mapped into the model, and all models showed stability. Satellite drift confirmed projection alignment. There was no cause for alarm. Sometimes, he added, the field conditions just looked different than the data. Then he chuckled and added, that's why we're lucky to have boots on the ground, guts and grit. Even if it's not always scientific. Someone near the projector grinned faintly. A chair shifted. The subject changed. Riley didn't sit down. She didn't press the point. She folded the chart in half again, slow and silent, and slipped it back into her vest pocket. The conversation moved on to transport rotation and fuel logistics. Her sector was not reassigned. No one mentioned her name. No one asked her to stay behind or follow up. On the way out, she passed the comms trailer. A narrow generator buzzed on a low hum nearby. But the real sound came from a black box, mounted behind the cabin. It emitted a steady hiss, white noise, unmodulated. It wasn't part of the standard comms suite. She stopped for half a second, just long enough to register it. Then she kept walking. Behind her, the tent buzzed again with filtered air and muted conversation. One of the analysts reset the map. Sector Delta blinked twice, then changed color. Ridge 6 disappeared from the active frame. The night over Ridge 6 had settled into a quiet too complete to feel natural. Wind pressed faintly through the upper tree line, dry and high. Below, the forest held its breath. Riley had positioned herself against a large basalt outcrop just east of the marker pole. Her pæk sat beside her. still closed. The radio on her shoulder clicked with static once every 10 minutes, then dropped back to silence. She watched the darkness beyond the containment line, eyes used to the shapes, the flicker of distant ember drift, the dim orange threads of slow fire, but what caught her eye just past midnight wasn't ember at all. It was a pulse brief and clean, white, not orange, not red, no flicker, just one sustained blink against the edge of the ridgeline, like a camera flash buried under canopy. She froze in place, not from fear, but calculation. Her hand hovered over the radio. She tapped the mic and gave a quick line report. No call sign came back. Only a burst of static, sharper than normal. She waited 5 seconds, then repeated, "Nothing." Her breath stayed steady. She marked the direction, checked her flashlight, but left it off, and started down the slope. The terrain dropped fast. Brittle shale mixed with thin ash. She moved with controlled pace, boots placed heel to toe, letting each step settle before shifting her weight. Below, the forest opened slightly, exposing a hollow just wide enough to hold a single helicopter or a small convoy of vehicles. The smell changed first. Not wood smoke, something chemical, melted plastic, burned rubber. She pulled her glove tighter, adjusted her footing, and approached. At the center of the hollow, the ground was blackened, but not from wildfire. There were no grass rings, no brush trails, no feeder flame paths, just a square of scorched earth, compressed and sunken in perfect grid alignment. Tire impressions looped around the edge, too heavy for fire service vehicles. She stepped closer and crouched beside a patch of charred soil, running her fingers over the indent. It was recent. The surface still held heat. Near the northern corner, something glinted in the dirt. She knelt and uncovered a strip of warped polymer. It had been a zip tie. Lagegauge. The kind used to secure cargo crates or personnel gear. One end had melted, curled back on itself like burnt ribbon. Etched along the spine was a small code, faint but readable under the soot. It ended with 4 numbers she recognized from a previous base's inventory format. Definitely not civilian. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the perimeter of the clearing. No movement, no light. The trees beyond the circle remained dark, their trunks glossy with heat haze. She waited, listening for engine drift or rotor echo. Nothing came. Her breath remained low and measured as she pocketed the zip tie, and backed out along her own entry path. Every step back up, the ridge felt heavier. Not from weight, but confirmation. This had been a lift zone. Clean, unlogged, and denied. At the top, she glanced once over her shoulder. The hollow had faded into black again. No light trace. No movement. The pulse was gone. It had never repeated. She reached her post before the hour changed. The wind had shifted slightly west. Her radio stayed quiet. She didn't report in. Instead, she sat down beside her pack, removed her notepad, and stared at a blank square she'd drawn the day before. In the corner, she wrote a single word in tight print. Extracted. She capped her pen, tucked the page away, and looked back toward the dark tree line. It held nothing now. No sound. No glow. Only the knowledge that someone had come and gone, and no one had called it in. The wind changed around 3 in the morning. Riley felt it shift along her jawline where her collar sat low against her neck. It came from the south now, cooler and steadier, moving the smoke in shallow horizontal waves across the trees. She stayed seated, back braced against the outcrop, her eyes fixed on a point in the dark that hadn't moved in over an hour. Sleep hadn't come. She didn't expect it to. The square in the valley kept returning to her mind, not in flashes, but as a shape, too clean, too intentional. She had seen that kind of geometry once before. Years ago, in a desert basin half a world away, she had crouched beside a burn pit that wouldn't cool. The flame color had shifted midway through the afternoon, blooming upward in a lurch instead of drifting out like usual. The fuel dump was too organized. She had noted it, logged it, circled it on her own chart. The report she filed mentioned directional spread inconsistent with known airflow. 2 days later, the official record listed the event as spontaneous combustion in high wind conditions. The wind had been still that day. Her captain at the time didn't scold her. He just looked up from his screen and said, "Ash drifts fast. Soldier, don't overthink it." That was all. No correction. No defense. Just dismissal that sounded like reassurance. She'd learned the tone. You couldn't argue with it. You could only choose not to forget. Before he'd been reassigned, Sergeant Millen had taught her how to track fuel ignition backward, not by temperature, by shape. Fire had memory. If it curved wrong, something pulled it. If it bloomed straight in no wind, someone gave it a push. She kept one torn notebook page from that tour, his sketch of an improvised heat echo against a compound wall. She'd folded it 4 times, tucked it inside her army journal, then later into her fireline kit. The paper was soft now, almost fabric at the creases. She hadn't looked at it in months, but she could still picture the note he'd scrawled beneath the drawing. Shape tells the story. Believe what you see. She reached toward her vest pocket, not to pull it out, just to feel that it was still there. Below, the forest remained still. No new light, no engineers, no voices. She didn't need more evidence. What she had seen fit the pattern. What she remembered confirmed it. And the silence around it was exactly what she had expected. By the time Riley reached the mobile ops trailer, the light had taken on that bright, colorless quality that only came after a long fire night. Everything looked bleach tense. Plastic crates, faces still shadowed by fatigue. She moved without urgency, but with purpose. Pack slung high, boots dusty to the laces. Her camera stayed zipped in the top pouch. She hadn't touched the settings since the ridge. When she stepped inside the trailer, the cooling unit hummed faintly overhead, and a tech behind the screen looked up just long enough to nod. The upload station sat in the back corner, half blocked by a stack of unopened meal crates. She slid the memory card from her camera, inserted it into the reader, and tapped through the prompts. The system recognized the file's 7 images, one tagged manually. The progress bar reached 62%, paused, then vanished. She waited. Nothing reappeared. The reader light blinked once and stayed dark. She ejected the card and tried again. No response. When she checked the file list on her camera, the folder was empty, not corrupted, just gone. A clipboard lay on the bench near the charging bay. She recognized it by the faded sticker across the top field rotation board. Her name was on the second page. Last column, with a heavy black line drawn through it. No reassignment. No comment. Outside. She stepped away from the trailer and leaned briefly against the metal siding. Letting the warmth press against her back, the sun had risen high enough to make the camp glare off every windshield. She heard the buzz of a handheld radio somewhere behind the latrine tent. A clipped voice said, "Final package moved before daylight." Then silence. The phrase settled deeper than it should have. Not recovered. Not extinguished. Moved. She walked toward the comms board posted by the dispatch cabin. A fresh map had been pinned beside it, laminated and clean. Sector tags updated. The area she had walked the night before, marked only yesterday as active perimeter, now read cleared and suppressed. The containment line had been extended past it. No heat markers remained. She studied the quadrant twice, blinked, and looked again. Even the terrain shading had changed. The ridge was labeled low burn. The valley floor wasn't labeled at all. A voice behind her broke the silence. "You're cleared for rest shift. Riley, you've been logged for relief. Just drop your gear by the inventory cage and check with medical for hydration protocol." She turned to face the speaker. Someone from the containment team. Clean vest. Sharp tone. No insignia. He didn't wait for her response. Just nodded and moved on. She made no argument. Just walked toward the gear cage. Unzipped her vest halfway. And pulled the SD card from her breast pocket. It sat warm in her palm. The plastic edge had a faint line of pressure wear. She looked at it for one breath, then dropped it into the padded slot of her field kit, knowing it would go nowhere. Inside the cage, the quartermaster didn't speak. He scanned her pack, handed her a wipe-down tag, and marked her name in pencil beside a different roster. The light outside had shifted again, casting sharper angles across the camp floor. Smoke from a nearby mop-up drifted low over the fuel drums, dulling the air. She stepped back into it slowly, hands loose at her sides. No one asked where she'd been. No one mentioned her name on the radio. She didn't need confirmation anymore. She had seen enough to know how the game worked. They weren't going to stop her, just erase her trail before it started. Riley moved before the sun had cleared the tree line. The camp was still in that soft lull between patrol rotations. When generators hummed low and voices stayed inside tents, she left nothing behind except a blank slot on the gear roster and a thermos half full on the bench. Her boots were laced tight, gaiter straps cinched to keep the soot out. She walked with steady purpose. Not fast. Not hesitant. Past the equipment row, behind the fuel depot, and through the narrow break in the brush they hadn't marked on the map. She didn't look back. The path through the burn zone had changed overnight. Ash layers had shifted in the wind, coating fallen branches and sealing over old footprints. The smoke hung low now, not from flame, but from heat bleed, curling just above the surface like breath held against the ground. She kept low, one hand brushing tree trunks for balance, the other free and loose by her belt. Every 10 steps, she paused, not because she feared being followed, but because habit told her the land always speaks first in silence. She reached the edge of the restricted quadrant in under 30 minutes. The terrain dipped into a shallow bowl of blackened earth where nothing green remained. The surface was uneven, scraped hard in spots, smooth in others, like a wound half-healed by wind. Near the base of the slope, something metallic caught her eye. She crouched, sifted aside a layer of loose ash, and uncovered a rounded cap just beneath the surface. It was a sensor node, partially melted at the edges, still warm to the touch. She brushed the casing with a gloved hand and read the code etched near the base. 2 of the prefix digits matched a format she hadn't seen since her last year of service. This wasn't contractor equipment, and it wasn't firefighter inventory. She logged the location in her notebook with calm precision grid coordinate, elevation, wind direction, thermal scent in the air. Then she pulled out her backup camera, one she kept hidden in her bedroll, and snapped 3 quick photos before moving on. Near the east ridge, the trees had been felled not by flame but by weight. Several trunks were crushed in parallel lines. Just beyond them sat a shallow pit, the ground layered with scorched plastic and warped casing lids. She stepped closer. The plastic had labels, blackened but legible. BioSeal, not fireproof, not standard. Smoke moved differently here, too clean, too consistent, as if vented on purpose. She followed it. The relay hut sat 20 yards beyond, barely visible, beneath a net of camouflaged mesh and brush that hadn't burned. It was small, low profile, built for transport and reassembly, The side panel was still warm. She didn't touch it. Just circled once. Noted the footing, the placement, the wind shadow behind the structure. She photographed it twice, both wide and close. Then she stepped back. The sound came faint at first, tires shifting over loose stone. She moved quickly behind a broken stump and crouched low as a utility vehicle crested the far slope. 2 men sat inside, heads down, scanning the ground, not talking. No uniforms, just hand jackets, dark glasses, and dust masks. The vehicle rolled slowly past her position. Unhurried. She waited until the sound faded completely, then rose and retraced her steps. Her exit route curved west to avoid the pit. Every motion was measured. She stepped only where her boot prints would be swallowed by the natural slope. At the edge of camp, the smoke began to thin again. She slipped between 2 empty water drums and ducked beneath the canvas edge of the unused mess tent. No one looked up. Inside her vest, the notebook rested flat against her chest. The camera stayed zipped in the pocket by her side. She didn't speak, didn't write the report. Not yet. She had what she needed. And for now, that was enough. Riley crossed the last bend, near the fuel depot, just after shift turnover. Her boots coated in ash to the laces, the taste of smoke still dry at the back of her tongue. The camp had already begun, its reset fresh rosters clipped to boards, new sector tags marked in green. She didn't stop to read them. She kept walking toward the mess tent, angled slightly toward the wash station. Eyes steady, shoulders loose, the kind of posture that made it easy to pass unnoticed. A man was waiting by the edge of the generator shelter. His vest was clean, hair short, and there were no patches on his sleeves. He wasn't tall, but he stood with the kind of stillness that didn't need height. He stepped forward with a lightness that caught her attention, more glide than footfall. He said her name once, not loud, not cold, just enough to make it sound like routine. She stopped, just barely, enough to give him space without giving him ground. He said she was being rotated out. Field conditions were stabilizing, and the base team had reviewed her intake. Fuel draw had been a bit high for a basic watch post. Probably nothing, but it triggered a check. Just protocol. She didn't answer, only raised one brow. A fraction. He smiled, the kind that didn't meet his eyes. There's no corridor by that designation, he said. His tone never changed. Nothing exists east of the reservoir, under the current map cycle. He reminded her that data flow must remain clean for post-incident review. No one wants confusion in the audit. Then he handed her a sealed envelope. It was blank on both sides. You'll want to file your report before the convoy pulls out tomorrow, he said. His voice was polite, just the right blend of concern and finality. She nodded once and stepped past him without turning her shoulders. The envelope stayed in her hand the rest of the evening, unopened. She didn't place it with the rest of her kit. She didn't discard it either. By morning, the site was gone. The ridge had been flattened, the slope smoothed over with scraped fill and soot. No pit, no mesh, no antenna or wheel marks. Even the brush looked repositioned, as if laid back into place by hand. The air smelled of fresh-turned ash and bleach. She stood at the edge for less than a minute, then turned away. The envelope never made it into her file. The shed smelled like dust and engine oil, even though the mower hadn't run in years. Light filtered in through a crack between the boards, soft and angled, just enough to catch the edges of the paper on the folding table. Riley sat with one boot braced against the leg of the stool, her elbows resting on the scarred plywood surface, a mug of lukewarm coffee going cold beside her. She turned the last page of her duplicate field notebook. The corners were bent. Ink faded in places where ash had smudged the margin. But the details were all there, grid references, Wind calls. Timestamps. Sketches. She hadn't written anything new in weeks. Not until now. Outside, the trees were quiet. Summer had dried the grass to a dull gold, and the only movement was the slow tilt of heat off the road. Far in the distance, over the hills beyond the tree line, a plume of smoke rose thin and straight into the sky. There had been no report about a controlled burn that morning. No listed ignition, just one column. Slow and steady. Coming from a place the map didn't label. She reached across the table and flipped open the small field radio case. Inside, wrapped in the lining, was a flash drive. She plugged it into her old laptop and waited as the screen flickered to life. The file window opened without sound. Images loaded one by one, grainy at first, then sharp. The relay hut, the sensor node, the burn pit edge. She compressed them into a folder and attached it to an outbound message. The address field held no name, just a long string of numbers that resolved to coordinates. She didn't write a subject, didn't add a signature, just pressed send. Afterward, she picked up the notebook again and turned to the inside back cover. A blank square of paper stared back. She drew one final line across it, a shallow arc, meant to mark the false perimeter she'd walked. Underneath, in quiet print, she wrote a sentence she hadn't forgotten. It was something her old mentor had told her the day before they pulled him from the team. Shape tells the story. Believe what you see. She circled it once, closed the notebook, and set it beside the mug. Outside, the smoke kept rising. Not fast. Not panicked. Just persistent. Riley didn't move toward it. She didn't call it in. She just watched. She was never the loudest voice in the room. Never the one at the center of the map or the front of the briefing tent. They gave her the margins. The watch posts. The quiet zones they didn't expect to shift. But she paid attention. She saw what didn't fit. And when no one else listened, she moved anyway. Not to prove a point. Not for recognition, but because the pattern was wrong and she trusted what she saw. Her steps were steady. Her choice was clear. And in the end, it mattered. This is a story for anyone who has been overlooked but not deterred. For those who keep showing up, even when the system forgets their name. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to share your thoughts. Or follow for more stories like this about quiet strength, sharp eyes, and the courage to act when no one else will.